cold iron wind carried the smell of ash and pine, while a starless eye swept a battlefield. Yet, in the center of that black plain, a round shield of red, white, and blue rang out like a bell. The wind came from all directions and from none, and it tasted of old fires and an older malice. Beneath that unseen vigilance, a stranger stumbled ashore, no herald, no guiding hand, his breath ragged, his uniform singed at the edges, a modern emblem incongruous upon a land grown out of legend. Steve Rogers steadied himself by instinct. His fingers found the rim of his shield and closed upon it as if upon a promise. The plain was not a place for a man of New York, and yet neither was it wholly foreign. He had seen battle before he knew the geometry of terror, the way men fold, the instant a line becomes chaos, the sound of morale breaking like thin glass. Here, though, the rules had shifted. Stones seemed older, their shadows longer. Air moved as if it remembered other ages, and the very weight of his body felt revised by measures he had never learned. He crouched instinctively to catch a thrown knife and found his balance a fraction out of step. Physics, he thought, was polite where he had expected brutality. Some things bent, some things did not. A troop of routed men pressed their backs against a ruined wall, faces wet with smoke and with the black fear that comes from seeing the impossible. Their garb was more rustic than the uniforms he knew, chain and leather, cloaks of muted green and brown, but their eyes were the same human brown that had learned to trust in steady hands. A figure in their midst, older than the others, a captain by posture, saw the stranger and dared a hopeful lift of brows. Hope was a small, dangerous thing, and it hissed like embers when a ringwraith's shadow slid across it. The first of the Nazgul came as one might describe a blight on weather, not arriving, but descending, the world rearranging itself around its presence. Its horse was blacker than night, its mane like smoke, and the rider wore no face that the eye could name. Where it turned, colors dimmed, even breath seemed to falter in the throat. It moved with inexorable hunger, fast for a thing that resembled a ghost. The routed men made as if to flee, but terror has teeth, and it bit deep. The rider pointed, not with hand, but with command, and a strange cold voice, heard more deep inside than in air, demanded of those humans a single thing. Submission. That demand was a thing without mercy. It did not ask for surrender in a gentle voice, nor did it offer terms. It spoke the old language of domination and of binding, the sound of rings and of promises broken. The men crouched lower still, some with an instinctive bow, others with hands spread in supplication. The captain closed his eyes and opened them as if to find some ledge of courage. He was not the first to consider bending a knee to save his life. There were bargains in this world that men made with sickness in their throats. Steve Rogers heard the demand as well. The command brushed his mind like a winter gust, and for a moment, confusion and a foreign dislocated home pressed against his ribs. He had been trained to obey orders, to accept discipline where it existed, to do what must be done for the greater good. But this was not an order offered by a council he trusted. This was a demand from a shadow that counted men as spoils. He felt something ancient awake in him, a stubbornness older than any uniform. He had been called many names in many wars, but never one that meant traitor to oneself. He did not kneel. He did not speak any treaty. He walked forward. It was a simple motion and an extraordinary one. Where the others recoiled, the stranger stepped between the ringwraith and the clustered men, his shoulders squared to the dark. For an instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind fell around him, and the ash-laden air hushed to hear a human heart. He set his shield upon his arm and brought it up as if the metal and paint were a church bell rung in defiance. The red was bright even beneath the pall of smoke, the white a small stubborn sun, the blue a night that would not yield. The Nazgul gazed at him as a hawk studies a new quarry. There was no scorn in that gaze, merely a cold accounting. It had seen kings and kings' kin and 1,000 pities. It counted only the ease of taking. Its horse pawed the earth as if to begin, to close the distance. The wraith reached for him with cold that was not weather, but will. "Submit," it whispered, and the whisper was felt like iron upon the soul. His answer was not long, and it needed no flourish. He threw the shield. The arc was almost casual, as if tossing a stone, yet it carried a strength that betrayed practice and belief. The shield flew true, a round disk of color and purpose, and it struck the field between the riders and the hiding men. The sound it made was not of clanging metal alone. It rang through the sky like a proclamation. For a heartbeat, the Nazgul recoiled in a way the others had not witnessed. Men looked up, their faces split between astonishment and a hope so raw it nearly hurt. Little things happened then, like dominoes set in motion. A young spearman straightened, gripping his weapon with the new idea of standing rather than running. A woman in a mud-caked cloak lifted her chin to better see the stranger. The older captain, the one who had almost bowed, found his knees unwilling to fold now. Courage must sometimes be borrowed, and it often came from small acts. A thrown shield was such an act, and like a coin dropped into a cup. It bought them a moment. Steve picked up another shield from the ground, one scuffed and unpainted, and held it before him. He had expected his own shield to return to him as it always did. It did not. In this land, the ordinary laws did not entirely hold. The round disc lay where it had struck, humming faintly with an energy his hands could not name. He felt exposed all the same, but his feet were planted. He spoke, not in any tongue they knew, but in a cadence that was clear enough. "You will not take them," he said simply, and there was no regret in his voice. Words travel oddly where the old power walks. Some took him for a leader born of myth, others for a fool. Yet a few found strength in his certainty. The captain strode forward now, boot to earth, and rallied the men with a short, barked order. "Line!" he commanded, and men scrambled, forming an uneven front behind the stranger, whose shield shone like a challenge. It was a fragile line, a child's fence against a winter. Still, it was something. The Nazgul considered the new development and tilted its head as if examining a curiosity. Its masters beneath the dark had not anticipated this particular variable, a man who would not yield. That lack of anticipation altered engines of thought the shadow had come to rely upon. It narrowed its unseen gaze. The writers are patient, history has taught. But patient does not mean idle. Their counsel moves like glacier and like knife. It can be sudden and it can be final. From the dim edge of the plain, other shadows detach themselves like stains in water. An envoy of Sauron's servants, taller, leaner creatures, less a storm than a precise instrument, glided forward. They carried no banners, yet their intent was heavy as anvils. One of them, cloaked and with an air like winter seas, lifted a hand to the Nazgul and spoke in a whisper that was felt rather than heard. The command passed like a circuit closing. The Nazgul ceased its testing and set the stranger as its new mark. A hunting shadow was laid upon him then, not with words that men can easily repeat, but with the slow suffocation of attention. He felt it as a pressure at the base of his skull, an awareness that focused like a lens of cold flame. The horses stamped. The other routed men who had taken heart now slid into a new silence that was all teeth. Face to face with such concentration, courage grows thin. Steve tasted iron and pine and something else beneath both, a note like warning bell. He had been trained to follow a mission until orders changed. He had been taught sacrifice and to shoulder the unseen weight of those he protected. That training told him to hold. Another, less taught instinct told him the land was not fit for the same strategies. The plain did not run on the same mathematics he had learned. Still, he planted his heels and watched the shadow lengthen. In that lengthening, the sky itself seemed to darken, not with clouds, but with intent. The Nazgul's horse pricked its ears as if sensing a scent no other beast could know. Around the stranger, the men steadied, a few more stepping closer until shoulder met shoulder. What they were building amounted to a circle of cloth and bone and hope around a single, impossible man. The stranger held his breath like a bell waiting to be struck. The hunting shadow tightened its focus and, with a motion both languid and sudden, it wheeled toward him. The horse's hooves struck the ground like drumbeats counting down. In that cadence, 1,000 small decisions were being made across the plain, heads turning, fingers finding weapons, prayers muttered under breath. The stranger's jaw set. He did not look away. He could have fled on some reflex born in other wars, but his feet remembered a different mandate, to stand between threat and helplessness. As the Nazgul drew near, a sound rose from all of them together, not a cry of defiance, not yet, but a chorus of held breath, an intake that made the air shiver. The stranger lifted the unpainted shield in his left hand and placed the painted one, his one honest proclamation, where any blade or shadow should strike first. He did not know if metal would hold against ringed malice, but he knew about promises. He had kept others. He had kept this one, too, in whatever world he walked. The field contracted to a blade's width, horses and men, and the watching sky narrowed to intent and to decision. The hunting shadow fell. It came like winter comes, inevitable and swift. The stranger's shoulders tensed as if to bear a storm, and those behind him tightened accordingly. The world held itself to a single moment poised between two outcomes, the taking and the resisting. He could still choose to retreat. He could still let his shield lie and save his life for another dawn. He did not. He stood. The hunting shadow descended, and with it came the promise of motion that would not stop until one side yielded. The road took them slow. It wound beneath a sky that clung low to the hills like an old gray cloak, and the trees leaned as if to listen. Steve walked at the back, his shield slung across his back, its enamel still smelling faintly of oil and sea. Each footfall on the packed earth sounded different to him here, not the cadence of drill or parade, but the wary step of those who know the ground may turn upon them at any moment. Hobbits walked with a softness he could not match, but they walked sure, and Frodo, when he walked, carried something in his eyes that made the soldier still his weapons in his hands. Gandalf watched him often, as a sea-worn mariner watches a novice at the helm. Sometimes the wizard's glance was a breeze that smoothed a ruffled sail. At other times, it was a stark wind that revealed the broken places in a man's heart. You are made for a different world, Gandalf said once, in a voice that folded into the wind like a benediction. "Here, steel will save you from steel, but there are wills in this world that turn iron to rust and steel to folly. Learn the measure of things, Captain. Learn to be long before you are strong." So Steve learned the long way. Aragorn taught him how the land speaks without words. He showed him tracks that were not tracks, only a bending of grass, a sorrowing of leaves. "Listen," Aragorn said, and the ranger's hand was a thin shadow across the trail. Steve learned to look for silence, to trust an absence as much as a sound. Legolas laughed and taught him a small feudings of footwork, how an elf moves like water around an unseen stone. Gimli, with a grudging ease, gave him the honest clang of axes and the secure weight of a blow. From Boromir came a different lesson, the fervor of one who would charge, the speech of a man who believes banners can bind fate. Steve watched them all and fashioned himself anew, not only in muscle and make, but in restraint. He found restraint harder than any drill. In the night, when hobbits stirred in their blankets and the fire spoke small bright words to the sky, his hands would twitch to measure 100 enemies and to teach 1,000 men to hold a line. But the line they sought to hold here was not of men and shields alone. Frodo's presence was a small, tremulous pivot in the camp. The ring he bore, no circlet of gold, but a weight upon the spirit, cast shadows that the eye could not easily name. Steve felt it as one feels a frost under the skin. It was not a thing to be struck with steel. It leached cheer quietly, like damp from root to branch. Sam kept near Frodo, a round-hearted sentinel who did not read the same signs but felt them. "You did well today," Sam told Steve one evening, his face yellow in the firelight. The hobbit's words were plain, but they steadied the stranger more than the praise of princes. Frodo alone would sometimes look up at him with a steadiness that surprised him, as if measuring what might be given in return for such a burden. There was an honesty to Frodo's fear that needed no speech. It needed equality of courage. Steve found he had little skill for the quiet courage demanded here, but he had will, and will can be tempered like any sword. The road brought them to a narrow pass under stony teeth. The day before, the weather had been mild that morning. A wind blew from the north that tasted of iron and old grief. Aragorn halted them at the pass's mouth and narrowed his eyes. The trees there were knotted and old, and where they met the sky, the stone cast a thin, hungry shade. "This is a place where men of ill will hide," he said. "Be wary. The ground will tell you little if you do not listen." He spoke quietly, but every voice turned to him as to a beacon, and Steve felt his own heartbeat answer the call. They moved through in bands. Legolas walked like a blade, drawn Gimli's boots beat like a smith's hammer. Boromir strode with that iron certainty that had both steadied and worried the company. The hobbits clung to the middle, and Frodo's shoulders seemed smaller beneath the cloaks and the weight. From his saddlebag, Aragorn took a small horn and sounded it, a low, murmuring tone that drifted gray and quick between the stones. It was an old signal, a speaking of kin and caution. From that sound, the company felt knit as if by a single cord. The first shadow came without herald. A troop of orcs dropped down the slope. Silent as a sliver of night, they were not many, but they were swift and vicious-eyed. Arrows rose like stinging rain. Steve's training, old and raw, moved through him the instant the dangers named themselves. He stepped before Frodo as if the measure of his life could be judged by that single motion. The shield came up, an arc of star and scarlet, and a spray of arrows struck it with a sound like sudden hail. The first struck with a crack that sent fire up his arm. The second came closer, burying wood into flesh and cloth. He tilted the shield, and the rest slid away. Close enough now to see them, he met the orcs not with the furious charge of a battalion commander, but with a focused, savage calm. He used the shield not merely to block, but to shepherd. He pushed them past the hobbits, to the flanks, and forced them into the open. Aragorn and Legolas answered, and Gimli's axe sang. Boromir braced and took blows with a warrior's grimace. The skirmish lasted not long. No song would be made for it, but it left the pass smelling of smoke and crushed earth. Men breathed hard. Hobbits stared as if from a doorway. After, in the hush, Gandalf lay a hand on Steve's shoulder as if to weigh him. "You did well," the wizard said, and his voice did not need to swell to praise. "Yet you must learn to bend more than your arm. Strength will scatter them for a while, but the shadow will mend itself. There are times to stand as wall and times to stand as whisper. Learn both." Steve felt the words like cold water. He had always put a name and a measure to courage: hold, strike, win. Here, cunning and patience wrapped themselves with the courage. He had to grow those limbs. The company made camp where the pass opened to a small bleak field. No star seemed to sit cleanly in that sky. Frodo lay awake for a long while that night, watching the embers. Steve kept his watch close, not because the orcs had been many, but because he saw something in Boromir at the edge of the firelight, a look that contained a map of desires. He had not known greed in his old wars, not as a noble force. He had faced men who wanted land or to be remembered. Boromir's want was sharp and noble-sounding. He spoke of Gondor and the need to save it. Yet the hunger in him looked hungry enough to take any just cause and twist it into self-justification. Steve understood want intimately. He had worn it as a soldier wears uniform, purpose braided into the seams of action. But the way the ring could make want monstrous had a taste he had not known. He watched Boromir laugh too readily and saw his hand rest too long on his sword's hilt. He watched the way his eyes drifted to Frodo, not always with fellowship, but with a measuring that gave Steve a cold, careful fear. A man who would take a sword for his city might also take a ring for his city, and the two acts were mirror-twin terrible. In the small hours, Gandalf came to him again, walking in the white mist that crept along the ground. "You will be called a standard," the wizard said, "and a shield, yet remember the deeper work." He paused, and his pipe smoke curled around his words. "There is a cunning older than any blade, a deed that is done with a look and with a hand, with a timely silence and with a timely tale. Learn to read hearts, Captain. There is no training for that in your books, but you will gain it with watchfulness." Steve took the watch then with new intent. He sat where he could see both the hobbits and Boromir, and he let his mind do the slow work of listening. He learned to count the seconds between laughter and speech, to feel the slight tremor when Frodo's fingers tightened around his cloak. He learned to watch the way a man's jaw set when old pride rose, and how swiftly a proud man would justify a taking if he believed it would usher in glory. The night pressed close, and the company slept around him like a small, fragile world. He wrapped his cloak tighter and felt the cold, quiet iron at his side for what it was, a promise. Dawn moved as an old procession, not rushing, but inexorable. Plans were remade at the first light. No one spoke of the ring's nature aloud. Such naming would be dangerous. Yet the direction they chose had a pull like the turning of tide. There would be new roads ahead, new dangers would gather like vultures over carrion. Frodo was to be protected when they moved, but protection now meant more than a shield. It meant the holding of desire in place, of watching and when needed, of moving between a friend and his fall. Steve rose with an intention pressed into him. He would not be a mere muscle for triumph. He would be a steward of the fragile hope that walked beside him in small feet and bowed shoulders. He would learn to make of his shield not only a wall, but a mirror for other men's better natures. He would be the emblem that said, by his steady presence, that some things were not to be taken and some things were to be borne. As they saddled pack and tightened straps, Boromir came to him. The captain's face was clear in the dawn, not mocking and not warm. "You are a strange blade in strange hands," Boromir said, and there was a note in his tone that might have been a challenge. "Will you stand where it matters?" Steve met him without a smile. "I will stand where I am needed," he answered. He did not say that he would stand between friends if he must, but the answer was in his posture. He had accepted a role he had never trained for. He had become a symbol and a shield, yes, but he had also chosen to hold the thin tether between men's good names and the dark of their want. They moved out then, a single thread across a page of gray. The road before them rose and folded like an old wound, and green closed behind them like a gate. The company's voices were small and focused. Frodo walked with his head down more than once, and Sam's hand found his without fuss. Behind them, the forests watched above them. The gray sky looked on like a patient god. Steve felt as they went the weight of what he had chosen. He carried it not in the shield on his arm, but in the steadying of his breath. The turn of the road would bring new peril. The presence that sought the ring was not idle. It moved like cold wind, patient and sure. And in the heart of the company, which included princes and rangers and stout dwarf and certain elf, a question now sat like a seed. Who would be the first to yield to the whisper of making wrong things right by wrong hands? Steve felt that seed pricking the soil. He tightened his fingers on his shield strap and walked on, a bright figure in an older world, choosing to stand where the light was weakest and the need strongest. Dust and smoke clung to the teeth of the morning like a thin, dark veil, and upon that veil the sun burned a dull coin. The plains breathed and sighed beneath the tread of many feet, a living thing that shivered when engines and horns shook the air. Men squinted under ash, and the iron taste of war horses stamped and snorted, their flanks splashed with the mud of recent rains. From the eastern rim of sight, the armies of dread advanced, a serried tide of banners and iron, and the land itself seemed to tilt toward shadow. Steve moved among them as if he belonged to that shadow no more than to the light. He went from knot of spearmen to battery of archers, hands quick as thought, straightening a raw recruit's grip on a pike, shifting a crossbowman's aim by the width of a palm, teaching a drummer to match the rhythm of retreat to the fall of the enemy's march. Nothing in his manner was lordly, his voice was coarse with smoke and use, but it had the clarity of a bell. "Hold the easement," he said once, and the men took the place between two gullies as if they had always treasured it. Where banners drooped in soot and despair, he hammered scrapwood into short staves and painted little symbols on them, circles, a star, a straight line, tokens the tired could clutch and remember by. Those small things caught and kept courage better than any speech. Aragorn kept to the grander line. He rode the ridges, his cloak a darker shadow against the pall, and his orders stitched the large tapestry of defense. Who should form shield wall? Which units should fall back to counter a flanking lantern of smoke? His voice reached farther, where Steve offered an individual torch. Aragorn kept the watchfires aligned. The two worked in different keys. One turned siegecraft into song and sally. The other made the great and steady music of a field. Men spoke of both with the same reverence the younger fighters learned to follow either call. Steve's tactics braided into the land. He took small bands, no more than a score, and taught them to vanish like swallows between rain. They dug shallow pits under stony hedges and set fallen spears as spikes. They hung blackened hides on low branches to catch and funnel the eye of a pursuing force. They fed false trails with discarded boots and a thrown spear. When engines rolled by, they struck the rope and timber, then dissolved into gullies where only the keenest of trackers might find them. Each action was quick and exact as a surgeon's cut. Enemy wagons toppled in narrow ways. A catapult that had thundered all night found itself stranded between rocks, its crew taken silently in the dark hours. Men who had been numb with fear laughed once it was done, a harsh, bright sound that startled those nearby, as if laughter itself might be an offensive weapon. These deeds carried more than utility. In the wide, bleak world of the plain, to see one man stand and not be cowed was a contagion. A fighter who had lost his brother looked where Steve had just been and thought perhaps that he could walk one more mile. An old veteran, bent with 100 scars, would grip his spear and recall how a painted circle had been thrust into his palm. The painted circle became a promise. It was not much, but in the battered hours, promises were coin. The men began to paint their own circles upon shields and shields upon shields until the field, from a distance, looked like a congregation of quiet suns. Sauron noticed these suns. The dark will does not stare at stone and wood alone, it seeks the living flint that sparks. Enemy commanders found their plans unraveling at the edges, not because men were surpassed in might, but because their hearts gleamed stubbornly when a small band appeared to say, "Hold, the Dark Lord sent new arrays to snuff these lights." More orcs came at certain places, and from the high places rode black figures that made the air colder when they passed. The steeds of those riders drank in the light of the world and left a wake of deeper night. Their presence was a pin placed in a map, a point toward which all threads began to run taut. When the black riders found the pattern Steve made, they changed their course. They cut across a ridge in wider arcs. They hunted in ways that suggested purpose and not mere chaos. The first time a Nazgul's shadow fell on a small sally, men froze mid-step, and a line of archers released their bolts in a single, long volley. The beasts they rode were like nothing the fields had known, great, winged horrors that made even seasoned horsemen draw back as if from a burning brand. Their cries steeled a dreadful hush. Men who had been warmed by Steve's token now looked at him with a new light, gratitude stamped with fear. The enemy had singled out the living patterns and sought to quench them at the source. It was then that the fatal geometry became plain. By striking where Steve and his bands were, the enemy forced lines to bend and to thicken. Where once a field could be defended in breadth, it now had to be defended in pinpoints. A man is a good captain, but a poor bulwark alone, 10,000 men do not rejoice in an enemy who presses where a single heart beats. Each time Steve stepped out, a space opened somewhere else. Each daring hold that steadied a slope drew away men who might otherwise have stood in a great shield wall. Sauron's gaze became more than curiosity, it became intent. Skirmishers who had once been a boon began to be a vulnerability. Steve felt the change as if it were a weight upon his shoulder. He was not blind to the calculus of war. He saw the slight hardening in Aragorn's face at times when Steve took chances that risked a concentration of foes. He watched young fighters, those who had looked to him as if to a lantern, grow pale when they learned that their captain could be singled out. Some would mutter that a single man ought not to be an army's hinge. Others would bite that whisper down, for without that hinge, the whole gate might swing closed. The soldier inside him measured lives, the soldier elsewhere of another world measured meaning. There came a night when he sat upon a shattered ram and stared east until his eyes smarted and he understood what had been tasked to him. Orders shifted. Aragorn's commands became more precise and took account of Steve's patterns. Where before Steve might have been free to dart at will, he was now asked for specific feats. Places where a stand would draw more than needed, where his presence would be valuable rather than ruinous. In council, they argued with the gravity of men who knew death was a ledger to be balanced. They could not ask every man to be Steve, nor could they strip the field of what made men brave. So they reached for a middle path. Steve would become the beacon in a prescribed orbit. He would strike here and vanish there, a measured hazard rather than a constant temptation. But the enemy does not abide the slow calculus of councils. The Nazgul learned his orbit, and Sauron sent not only riders, but a new strain of force, wave after wave, that did not come to break a line, but to find a face. They hammered at the places Steve had held as if to saw him out of the battlements of morale. They pushed through forward-placed scouts like a blade through wet cloth, and when a small stand was taken, the doom that followed was not merely loss of ground, but a tide of sorrow that swept through the ranks. Men who had been steadied began to doubt whether a single light was worth the glare it drew. Steve watched those waves and felt something colder than fear. He felt the truth of being an island. An island can save ships, but if the sea is set to drown the shore itself, the island becomes a city's single weakness. He began to change his stands, less flamboyance, more calculation. He taught his bands to scatter before the shadow fell, to leave markers of smoke and bone to make the enemy pursue ghosts. He asked a small unit to hold a ford until the last breath, then quietly withdrew 2 hours later. He burned his symbols that had become too familiar and painted others on hides in the dark. Every artifice was an attempt to keep being a star without being the lone tree that a blight first strays toward. Still, the pressure mounted. Where once nations had been the center of Sauron's intent, now a single man's pattern occupied a large portion of his enemy's cunning. The field hummed with a sense that a direction was being chosen. The dark army, which had always been a multiplicity of threats, bent into a spear. Men named this bending in whispers. Some called it folly, some called it inevitability, and each whisper was a small bell that tolled for a choice yet to be made. On a morning threaded with a brittle wind, a courier came to Steve with a message from Aragorn. He listened without shifting his gaze from the east. The message was short and direct. "Make yourself a beacon if it is needed," Aragorn said aloud. and the words were neither plea nor command, but the exact weight of trust. Steve folded the paper and tucked it where he kept the small tokens men had given him: charred bits of wood, a scrap of a woman's shawl, a worn coin. He thought of the faces that had steadied under his shadow and of those that now trembled because of it. He thought of the plan that could use his being seen as both sword and sacrifice. When he rose, his armor scraped like a metronome. He strapped the shield to his back and felt the familiar, terrible responsibility of being visible. He walked to the highest hummock, where the wind took him and made him feel both small and vast. Below him, the ranks shifted like a living sea. Beyond, the dark riders were stars gathering into a black constellation. He looked at his own hands, scarred and steady, and he made a decision that would not be undone by counsel. He lifted the shield and struck it once, a bright, resonant note that carried over the plain, an open signal to friend and foe alike. And then he stepped forward, his boots pressing the earth that would remember him. As he walked, men who could not name why steadied themselves. Children who had been kept behind stones by mothers peered through gaps. The plain bent around his path like a river around a stone. Behind him, Aragorn gathered a force and moved, a slow and certain tide, toward a target the two of them had tacitly agreed upon. Ahead, beyond the strip of waking distance, Sauron's shadow congealed into something more directed, and riders broke from its edge like crows from a tree. Steve did not hurry, he did not flee. He bore his light, and with each stride he felt the weight of that single, dangerous radiance draw nearer. Gollum moved like smoke at the edge of the firelight, all bones and greedy wet sound. He had been nothing but a whisper in the dark for long years, and now he crept forward with that same patient hunger, as if he had pressed his ear to the world's wound and heard it murmuring the one word he had never wholly lost. His voice came at last, a hiss of syllables that were not quite a name and not quite a prayer. "It calls," he croaked, and then, to the ring itself, "It calls, and you answered." The true name that slipped from his lips was not learned lore or kingly title. It was a shape of meaning, older than crowns, older than the language of men, the thing that rules the will of wills, the heart of shadow, the ring that sits at the throat of the world. When Gollum said it, the air in the cave seemed to thin, and Steve felt the utter smallness of himself, as if someone had cupped his chest and fingered the soft place where courage and longing intermingled. The ring did not speak aloud. It never needed to. It moved like hunger in the dark, a presence that slid along bones and sinew. Steve heard it as a pressure, like the long silence before a battle broken by a single drum. It spoke in images as much as in promise, victory, and the smell of victory like gunmetal and smoke his friend spared, flags unfurled on hills, the turning of desperate tides. Power presented itself as a solution so swift and complete that his first, almost animal thought was not of rule, but of mercy, the mercy that ends slaughter by ending the slaughtered. He remembered another war, the one his hands still smelled faintly of, oil and clean metal and the cold tang of breath on a winter morning. He had learned then that men bent on saving could become tyrants by the very zeal they practiced. He had learned that a single perfect strike could make the world safe for only one kind of safety, and that safety might crush what it intended to save. That lesson rose now, a hard light on his shoulder, as he felt the ring's warm whisper like a hand at the back of his neck, encouraging him to take, to finish. The temptation came in the simplest of forms, The ring offered him a path where Sauron was no longer a looming scheme, but a defeated name. It showed him the black tower fallen inward like a spent column, its shadow collapsing. It showed Frodo standing on the lip of the fire and walking down without burden other than ash. It showed Mordor's armies unmade, as if men cut a rope and watched tide fall away. The vision was quick as a blade, and it brushed against his soldier's instincts, the part of him that always wanted to end campaigns with one decisive act. Then the ring asked for a price less thought than felt. Seize me, and you may claim what the ring calls its own. Grasp me, and the world will be arranged beneath your will. Be the hand that wields this iron-thin world, and you will be spared the need to trust others. It was not merely a bargain, it was a mirror held to the very loneliness in Steve's chest. He heard his own name answered by the ring, as if it had waited for him, as if the world had saved a vacancy for one disciplined heart. The thing wanted not just flesh, but the morrow of certainty. It promised the end of ambivalence, the end of fear. It would make him whole by means he had always distrusted. Gollum watched him with eyes like polished pebbles, swamp reflective and frantic. Take it, Gollum whispered between teeth. Take, and no more running, no more cold. Be master, yes, my precious, my master. He licked his lips at the image, his thin hands twitching. Steve closed his eyes, and the cave fell away. He stood on a battlefield without sound. Men bowed under suns that did not dim, cities rebuilt, and iron-bound, faces he loved preserved like coins in a box. In that silent panorama, his hand reached for an imagined ring that was not quite hot and not quite heavy. He could feel the old lesson as a ring inside him too, an oath hammered into childhood and reinforced by blood and mud. Power must not answer for others. It must be entrusted, shared, taken up with restraint, and relinquished when it wasted good men. He had sworn this before, in another language, to other men. The oath tasted of copper. It steadied him. He stepped back and opened his eyes. The ring recoiled a little, as if surprised at refusal, as if it had not been used to not being obeyed. A sound like a winded thing sighed out of the stone. Even Gollum, who had known only the small cruelties that the ring afforded, made a face like someone who had been denied the feel of fingers at his throat. Then trust me, Steve said. His voice was not loud. The sound of it filled the small distance between them. If it must be ended, let me be what draws the fire. Let me bend the gaze and keep the path open. Frodo, who had carried his own world in his pocket and in his face, looked at him with a strip of sunshot hope and fear. You would do this for us? He asked. And there was no accusation in the question, only the simple astonishment of a small man to whom great things were being granted. Sam's answer was not amazement. Sam's answer was like a rope. If you do, he said, square and without flourish, will not cast you away after. His small hand clenched the edge of his pack. His voice held the fierce faith of one who knows the value of friends like a miser counts coins. The vow Steve took was not sworn at stone, but sealed by intent. Such pledges in Middle-earth have weight enough. He promised to carry attention like a burden and not the ring itself. He would make himself the bait of a greater net. He would stand where eyes might find him and hold there a flare of defiance. He spoke the words as if he were signing his name on a map, placing himself on a road none of them wanted, but all of them needed. Aragorn gave him a look he had not offered to many. No man may stand before Sauron and remain unchanged, he said in a tone that was not counsel, but simple counsel's old truth. Aragorn's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, not in challenge, but as a man might touch a sick child's brow to measure fever. If you take their hatred, you take their doom as well. Be sure you wish that. Then give me their doom and their time, Steve answered. He had the soldiers reckoning now, the careful estimate of how much a single body could buy. There was a map in his mind, drawn in light and shadow, Frodo moving quick as a mouse across boiling rock, Sam at his shoulder, paths that narrowed like the throat of a bottle. Somewhere above them, a net would fall, and what the net took would be the wrong thing if they did not think to set a decoy. He was not naive about what Sauron would do to a singular bright figure. He simply accepted that. Some sacrifices were chosen, and this would be one he accepted with his eyes open. Gollum made a sound between amusement and grief. "Yes," he muttered, "go. Go with your bright shield. He will look and look, and then there will be two to take. He will not be content with one." The creature's little head cocked. In him, hunger and cunning had learned the same thing. Sauron's gaze was greedy. It would not rest while there were two appetites to feed. They moved then, stone to stone, the group rehearsing in silence what would be done. Steve hefted not a ring, but his shield, a round thing of new metal that seemed both very small and, in its way, unbearably loud. It clanged softly as he walked, a sound like distant bells. To carry the attention meant something simple: be seen. Wear a mark that would catch the black eye. Make a light where there had been only smudge. Make a shape to be pointed at. The first step upon the ash began the long answer. The path that led toward the high places was a ribbon of charcoal and wind, and as they climbed, the world behind them narrowed to a smear of smoke. The smell of the mountain grew, a living kitchen of stone and sulfur, the stinging taste of metal in the air. At intervals, small black birds wheeled and fell away, and the sky seemed thinner, as if the world had been skinned and the meat beneath revealed. Steve walked with a soldier's gait, measured and true. He felt the ring's gaze like cold fingers between his ribs. It tested him still, with little visions, banners under his command, a peace that required only his will, an end to wonder that would be named by him and him alone. Each image was like an ember rubbed on his sleeve. He did not take them. He let them float like ash and blow away. As they climbed, the land itself grew quieter, as if the very small things that made sound, birds, insects, the soft shifting of leaves, had learned fear. Only the hard things remained: cracked earth, blackened roots, stone like the knuckles of ancient giants. From behind them came the small, stubborn noises of hobbit feet and the steady breathing of men. Ahead, the summit showed itself, a mouth of light and heat. Higher and nearer to that mouth, the air grew liquid with a sense of being watched. It arrived not as sight, but as a pressure on the eardrums, like walking underwater. Steve felt it first as a tightening in his throat, then as a terrible small joy that the world was placing its attention upon him. He tasted iron and salt. Somewhere far off a bell clanged once, and the sound rolled like a coin down the spine of the world. "If Sauron turns," Frodo said, voice thin with smoke, "we will go like thieves, then pick your thieves well." Steve spoke back without looking over his shoulder. His words were a map and a promise all at once. Pick them well and hold fast. Below, Gollum slunk like a memory toward the dark. He had served his own hunger, and he had served others. His allegiance fluttered like a torn flag. He watched Steve with that half-adoring, half-jealous gaze, and his praise came out not as warmth, but as calculation. "The Bright One will burn the sky," he whispered half to himself. "He will burn, but he will leave a hole. The hole will be used." They climbed on. The mountain's breath grew hot, and the stones underfoot began to take on the color of old wounds. Shadows stretched thin and black like torn banners. To their left and their right, ridges fell away into smoke and ruin. Beyond them all, the flat plains of Mordor lay like a gray sea. And from that sea, like a spear of thought, a looking came, an intelligence spreading outward, drawing upon the talons of craft and malice, seeking the brightest light. Steve felt it then, the long, unblinking hunger of the dark. It struck at him not as pain, so much as recognition. He had been singled out, marked like a beacon. The ring's last test had been to show him the simple path to omnipotence. His answer had been to refuse that path and instead become the hand that would bear Sauron's gaze. He had chosen to be the dart, to be thrown. "Keep to the ridge," Aragorn said. "When the eye turns, draw it higher. Make it look for you and not for them." Steve nodded and drew his shield up. The metal caught the last pale light and flashed like a small star. In that gleam was everything he had been and everything he now meant to be. The soldier who held back the infinite by the width of his back, the man who would invite ruin upon himself that others might have a chance to step through fire. Far below, beyond roofs of crumbling stone, the eye that was not an eye, but a will in a tower, turned. The mountain answered it with a low, eager moan. The world contracted to the line between Steve and the dark tower. The time for the vow to be tested had come, a choice had been made, and now it must be paid with steps. Steve began to climb a narrower spur, a bright dot moving up the ash slope, and the company blurred into motion behind him, not to pull him back, but to carry the path he opened. He did not look back when the calling began in earnest. He did not need to. The vow sat heavy and true in his chest like a second heart, pumping steady and cold. Ahead was the fire, and behind him the watchful dark. He had stepped into a role no map had given him, and in that step the final death and final hope of this strange fellowship found a single hinge. The air that followed the ring's end was not silence in the ordinary sense. It was a falling away, as if some vast instrument of music had been unstrung, and the sound, deprived of tension, loosened into dust. For a moment, the world listened and knew itself undone. Heat still blinked in the stone, but the great pressure of malice that had driven the winds and stoked the fires of Mordor was gone. The very smoke seemed to inhale and shudder, and ash drifted like slow gray rain. On the lip of the crater, beneath a sky that had been blackened by the eye, a man in a faded uniform knelt, his hand braced upon a shield that had been planted as if it were a stake set against fate. Where Sauron's will had been a single terrible needle, it now uncoiled like a rope cut loose. The shapes that had been steadied by dread faltered. The black banners fell limp, the horns ceased to find breath, and men and beasts and fell thing alike stood bewildered in the hollow left behind, as if a great bell had been struck and now all listeners had lost their places. Far below, the cinder-steeped ridges of the mountain broke and sloughed spouts of steam hissed from fissures, and a smell of old iron and burned cord stained the air. The tower of Sauron groaned, a sound like stone giving over to a long sleep, and somewhere within its ruined ribs the last spark of that unholy thought guttered and died. Sauron's wrath had been poured first, and he had poured it like a furnace, throwing out molten intent. Legions closest to him were consumed by that seeking flame. Men and fell creatures who had tethered their wills to his were undone first, their forms slackening like puppets whose strings had been singed away. But his fury, when it found the man upon the lip, came not as a myriad of hands, but as one steady, hungry eye. It fixed upon him with a force that sought not merely to crush, but to possess. The world had thought to take dominion with the ring. It found instead a human wall, a man who would not take. There had been 100 small voices in the last hour, each a sense of possibility offered by a circle of gold. The ring had whispered of order, of an end to war, of law made by one will and enforced by obedience. Its promises were quicksilver, but they glittered with a terrible logic. To the wearied and the hopeful, they came as balm. To the proud, they came as coronation. The man on the rim heard that counsel as a thunder in the bone, and he saw in a rush sharp as a blade the world remade in iron, in perfectly kept peace, in the neat lines of a single hand. The temptation burned like light on his lids. He felt his muscles answer the lie, felt an ancient soldier's desire to do what is effective, to conclude suffering by taking command. He chose otherwise. He put his body where no law could be written. He set his shield deep and held it there with the last of his strength, not to seize, but to shelter. The sound of the ring's pleading was like 1,000 small voices saying, "Take," and he heard instead, in a voice colder and truer, "Resist." He resisted, and in resisting, he became a focus for that unspent malice. Sauron struck at him with a concentrated hate that unspooled like acid. It burned his flesh in the way of great winter. It took from him heat and the immediate capacity to stand. But it could not seize the part that was his will. The price was laid upon him with a long, slow cruelty. His arms were scorched. Where the shield met his palms, the metal blackened and sang with a sound like old bells. He felt his breath come ragged the serum in his blood, which had once quickened him beyond mortal bounds, frightened at this touching, and went cold as if it had never been. He lost things that were not counted at the field, the easy confidence of a man who had thought he could carry a world upon his shoulders, the innocence that had given his judgment its light. There were phantom weights left behind, like shadows of chains. Men who saw him later would speak of a hollowness in his eyes, as if a corridor had been opened inside him by which the memory of the ring might sometimes pass, whispering still. Yet he would not lift his hand to take what would break the world into lesser freedoms. When the shadow that had held so much was loosed, it recoiled. The Nazgul collapsed, not with a shriek of bones, but with the sudden loss of motive. They who had been bound to a thought became like ships adrift with no wind. In the plain below, the mobs of ruin, those countless engines of fear, toppled as if unseen hands had taken away their purpose. The very earth turned its shoulder and spat out the smoke. Where once had been armies and black towers and the stench of forced rule, there now moved only the slow dawning of astonishment and grief. From the distance a cry went up, not of triumph, but of the rawest surprise. Men and creatures who had held their breath for years found themselves thrown back into the smallness of living. And yet, the end of tyranny did not come without cost. The soldier upon the rim had taken blows that would mark him for as long as memory named him. The wound in him was not only of sinew and ash. Some stain clung to his spirit. It would make him a thing apart. People would call him hero or martyr, or mad some would whisper that he had tasted dominion and been refused by fate. None could tell how to mend what had been broken. There was no healer for certain kinds of sacrifice. He lay propped upon the convex of his shield as the mountain sighed and the smoke thinned, and he listened to the slow song of the world remaking itself in ways both pitiful and beautiful. Others came when they could. Figures like frail lamps approached through the ash. Those who had fought in other ranks, those who had borne memory and fear, those who had more right to claim gratitude than to give it. There were hands that sought him then, hands to lift, to bind, to reproach, to bless. He took none of these easily. Gratitude tasted now of ash. The words of kings felt like obligations. Once, he would have listened to counsel and accepted honors if they were given in truth. Now, he found himself reluctant to take anything beyond the cover of his shield. He had looked upon the face of power and chosen to avert his eyes. The texture of that choice had not smoothed with time. When, at last, he tried to rise, the world steadied and rolled like a ship in a long sea. He pushed himself up, his limbs uncertain, and the shield came with him like a companion too large for any hearth. He had been the barrier that allowed destruction. He had not claimed the offered crown. In the hush that followed, there were two kinds of music: the slow, practical sound of hands clearing the wreckage, and the other, keener music of futures unfolding. Men whispered of rebuilding towns and replanting fields, of laws to be remade without the iron hand. Children who had been raised by terror would one day learn the names of flowers. The world leaned forward toward those small things that mean peace. He stood for a while upon the rim and watched those hands work, watching as if what they built might contain him. The mountain under his feet had been the place of endings. The valley below would be the place of beginnings. He had made a choice that unmade a dictator and spared countless lives. And yet, he had not been permitted the clean solace of a triumphal return. A shadow of what might have been lay heavy on him, a glass of bitter draught left unspilled. He understood now that courage had a cost measured not only in bodies, but in the continuing work of being a man unmade by power. Resistance did not heal everything. In the days that followed, tales would be told of the man in the faded uniform who had planted a shield in the last hour. In some versions, he was a saint; in others, a cautionary oak. Men would raise stones to his name, and poets would make him a footnote to heroics elsewhere. But in the quiet between those songs, he made a small and stubborn decision. He would not vanish into legend. He would not let his act become a trophy upon which others might hang excuses. If the world was to be free, then the work of freedom must be taught, tended, and kept. He resolved to go down from the mountain and to remain where his oath held meaning. His first steps were slow and halting, each one a negotiation with pain. He walked with his shield not as an emblem, but as a crutch. It steadied him more by memory than by steel. The path off Mount Doom was a raw road of ash and broken stone, and when he moved, he left prints that the wind would take. He bore no banners. He carried his face, scarred and set, through the new thin light. At his back, the smoking throat of the mountain cooled. In front of him, the world waited with its petty cruelties and its small mercies. He would go where the free peoples gathered, to counsel or to work, to confess or to teach. His voice would be a living ledger of what temptation could do, of the need to resist it. He did not know what the morrow would bring. Perhaps he would be a leader, and perhaps he would be a wanderer. He might live to feel laughter again and to taste bread unseasoned by fear, or he might go on bearing a tiredness that never fully left him. He had, however, one clear intent that would not be delayed any longer. He would carry the memory of this hour into the councils that would shape this age. He would tell, plainly and with no flourish, what he had seen when the ring offered the world a neat peace. He would warn that the easy ending is often a chain, and that to save a nation, one must sometimes give up the very power to bind it. So he began to descend. Each footfall was a small assertion that the world could be born without a single will to dominate it. The shield, warmed and blackened, traced the hard line of his path. He kept his gaze not fixed upon the horizon, but upon the work at his feet. A sapling struggling through ash, a woman who had lost much lifting a basket, a child staring at him with eyes too old for their years. These were the matters that would outlast tyrants. To stand guard, he had learned, was different from ruling. He would stand if standing was needed, and he would teach others to stand as well. Behind him, the crater cooled to a dull, patient red. Ahead, civility would be rebuilt from quarrel and apology. He had broken the line of domination and had paid in full the toll of his refusing the easy crown. With each step, he carried both the wound and its lesson, the knowledge that to refuse power is sometimes the only way to keep peace. He walked into the new world with the deliberate uncertainty of a man who had learned that salvation is not a triumph, but a task. And with that intent upon him, he took another step into the long work that must follow.